The bad news is they refuse to believe in Jesus and are not being healed. Hello, everyone, and welcome. We are Irenicast. I'm Jeff.
I'm Alan.
I'm Bonnie.
I'm Casey.
This is Rajiv.
On the first and third Tuesday of every month,
we bring to you our perspectives
on theology and culture
from a post-evangelical lens.
Thank you for joining us for another conversation to provoke your progressive Christian imagination. This week, we are going to be talking about faith healing based off of a listener suggestion. Melanie wrote into us on Facebook and said, "Can I put in a request for an episode on faith healing? My mom was diagnosed with MS when I was 13, and we went through a lot with it. I also work as a therapist for clients with disabilities, and 3 of them are Christians and have some very powerful experiences with it. I think you've covered a lot with prayer and how God acts, but they would be really interested in hearing your views." This comes in as a listener request. And for our segment this week, we're going to be bringing back an older segment that we did a while ago called Good News, Bad News, which is a lot of fun. Like I said, this week we're going to be talking about faith healing based off a listener suggestion. And I think that we all have varied experiences and thoughts about this particular issue based off of our limited. Basically, this is how the conversation's gone. Someone starts to share, "Hey, I think this," and then someone's like, No, stop, don't, wait. Wait till we get on air and share that. So there's going to be some impromptu nature to this. And I think it should be said right up front that our intention is not to dismiss any kind of belief, but share our experiences and then also, be objective about how we've seen it, not just the idea itself. But I think, speaking for me at least, it's always the next question for me is then how does it really affect people, and how do people use these ideas and thoughts if they're in a place of leadership and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, maybe I'm just throwing my hand out there. So let's start. Rajiv, let's start with you. What has kind of been your experience when you hear the word faith healing? What do you think? What goes through your mind and your heart and your soul?
Oh, man. I feel like I got set up. It's bad news. We're already started the segment. So in the Seventh-day Adventist tradition, the one that I grew up in, faith healing was like a big people were vilified. It's like, that's not what we do. If you're familiar with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they have a pretty large medical university in Southern California, hospitals all over the world. So traditional Western healthcare is kind of a big deal in the church, although real science beyond medical care is abstract because there's still a literal 6-day creation that's taught, and anti-evolution, kind of all mixed in there. The faith healing stuff was like, well, it's just gibberish. Those people, we feel bad for them. They're not bad people. But don't fall into those traps because it will ultimately lead you astray. So there's that on the one hand. And then on the other hand, I believe that there's power to pulling together for someone who's struggling, whether it be a mental illness, whether it be a physical ailment. When you know people are in your corner and pulling for you, there is something beneficial to that. I don't know that I personally believe in faith healing as some sort of divine entity deciding, I'm going to go ahead and fix you, and I'm not going to fix this other person. I don't think that's real, but I do think people pulling for one another through prayer, through holding vigils, keeping company, the whole visiting the sick thing, I think that matters.
Interesting. So just sharing from my experience, this was part of the reason that I was taught that, and again, this is going to be a little bit clash of backgrounds, but I was taught that Seventh-day Adventism was a little bit on like the line on whether we considered it a cult or not.
No, we were.
So I grew up Pentecostal. So faith healing was a central thing. Like it was, you always prayed for healing. You always prayed for healing. You had services for healing. And I remember being a little uncomfortable with that. And then I remember one time specifically, there was someone in our church who was very sick, and also relatively young, to be that sick. And we prayed, and then came the word. Someone spoke in tongues and another person translated it. And it was very, very clear. This person will be healed. This person will have recovery. This person, all that stuff. And then everyone celebrated, and I celebrated. I was crying. I was like, oh, this is so wonderful. Da, da, da. By the next Sunday, she was dead. And no one said a thing. And I remember being like upset. And I went to the associate pastor at the time, like after, and I was like, really, what the hell? How do we explain that? How do we, cause I was probably too zealous for my own good some days. And I was like, if we are going to say that we believe this tongues and interpretation thing, and we're going to say that this is the word of God, then when it doesn't happen, why isn't leadership saying anything about it? And I remember the answer I got. And it was an answer that I got a lot after this, but it was, they're in heaven now, and that's the ultimate healing. So there is no contradiction in the word that was given. And that, maybe I'm just creating,
sick.
I know, maybe I'm just creating my own narrative, but for me, that was like, that started my journey away. For like it, to me, when I think of like moments that really pushed me away, it was that. And I was like, no, this has to be looked at and reevaluated. So I will be honest. I mean, I think we have made this apparent as we've gone through the show. I wouldn't consider myself a mystic. That's not to say that I'm not open to things. And I certainly would never dismiss someone's experience, but I certainly don't default immediately to mystery and wonder and, woohoo, the world is, special. I don't know. Whatever goes along. And I know I'm being unfair with what mysticism is, and I know that it's deeper than that. But I'm just saying that this was a formative experience for me. So when I think of faith healing, I'm like, because I've seen what it's been used to do, and I see what an environment of faith healing priority does to people who don't get healed.
Yeah, Jeff, I want to jump in again real quick. You talked about the community praying for this young person. In the Seventh-day Adventist world, we did that too, with great fervor, hoping that something would happen. I can't remember a time where anyone was like, okay, we got the answer and it's going to be fine. It was always something like, medical science has done what it can do. The doctors, nurses, the experts have done what they can do, and now it's a matter of waiting and seeing. So let's pray in the hopes that the waiting and seeing will result favorably upon our sister or brother or whatever. But there was always this sense of like, we're not sure. We're hoping, but we're not sure.
Yeah, and that was not. Ours was, you believe that God's going to do something, and then if God doesn't, then the insinuation was you didn't believe, or that it was God's will. So that was the cop-out. But yeah, we'll get into it. I want to hear everyone else's experience. So
that's why I have complex feelings around this, is that I personally have experienced things I would call miraculous and healing in my own life. And there are stories in my family that have been passed down for several generations of healings. But in my family as well, there have been moments where people that are really close to my heart have been prayed for by communities, a lot like the one you're talking about, Jeff, and have been told like they just have to have enough faith to be healed. And when they're not healed, that they didn't have enough faith. And that kind of rhetoric is so isolating. It's so damaging and hurtful. And I've seen it firsthand. And also, sometimes people do have enough faith, right? Like they believe just as much as anyone else. And we're asking for healing. And I've also seen sometimes in communities othering people who have disabilities or who have different abilities, like whose lives or bodies may not look like, I don't know, mine, and saying that they need healing when they may or may not even want it. So there are people out there who are probably listening to this episode and they've had experiences where people have wanted their healing when they didn't want that kind of attention or narrative to be constantly spun around them. So this topic feels so complex and contextual to me that it's really tough to say something kind of universal, we're all like, to even know what is healing or quote unquote normal is so just vastly different from person to person. I just know for me personally, I had nightmares until it's all psychological, but I had nightmares until I was 10 years old, like waking night terrors, the kind that you can't wake up from and you see stuff everywhere. And my family prayed for me and it didn't work for a long time. And I went through a kind of a supernatural calling on Jesus, this like really intense religious experience where I was healed from that. And so it's hard for me. It may be completely psychological, but it's also real, for a young kid. And I've also worked in hospitals, Bonnie. I know, you know what I'm talking about. Working in a hospital as a chaplain, walking into a room and sitting with people who are going through the most horrific stuff you can possibly imagine. And, I don't know if sometimes for those, correct me if I'm wrong, Bonnie, but sometimes for those patients, the concepts of healing and of praying for healing are actually really good for them and a source of strength and a source of goodness. And it does make a difference. And I've seen it make a difference. And sometimes it's the very opposite. So I don't know how to approach this. I have more questions than answers for this episode, for dang sure.
I totally agree with you, Alan. I think it's super complex. And I think it relates to what we define as brokenness. What needs to be healed? Who gets to decide that? Is that a communal decision? Is that a personal decision? All of that is enmeshed in this conversation that we're having, and it's hard to extricate threads, really. It's kind of a big pot of soup.
So, Bonnie, when you hear faith healing, what about you? What is your reaction to that?
When I hear it, because it's not part of I also grew up Seventh-day Adventist, so it's not part of my tradition. I tend to just go toward like things I've seen on TV where there's a pastor praying in tongues and, there's this emotional fervor, and then there's some sort of like energy push on the person who is afflicted or hurt in some way. And then there's this proclamation, now you are healed. And I don't know if that's what really happens. I have only been to one or two actual services, and I was standing in the back, kind of overwhelmed by all the intensity that I wasn't able to fully take in what was going on. But that's what comes to mind. And I don't know if that's true or not. Jeff, I guess you're the one who could say whether or not that's what happens. But
I can tell you from experience, there is a force that pushes you down, but it's the arm of the pastor that's in front of you.
I only had that happen to me
experience. That's just my experience.
I didn't grow up Pentecostal. My family's kind of charismatic, but I had gone to a Calvary chapel where someone was praying for me, and they were pushing on my chest over and over, like almost giving me like a resuscitation while they're praying for me. Like, this is a little different than I'm used to. That's for sure. I
got a dirty look from a pastor once because the first church that I worked at as a youth pastor, he's trying to like push me over, and I pushed back. Like, I was like, and he stopped. I mean, he gave me a solemn look and shook his head and moved on to the next person. And I was like, come on, like, really? Be mad at me for, anyway, sorry, this is a side issue. Casey, how about you? What has been your experience or visceral reaction to the term faith healing?
Well, I mean, we can talk about episode 150 where we talked about praying the gay away, right?
Yes.
Talking about healing. What does that even mean? I also have some experience in the Pentecostal church, and I remember them pushing on me and thinking, I don't want to fall on the floor. So I just stood there because I wasn't trying to do that. But, I mean, I have lots of experiences around this because of the evangelicals that I was running with. That's all they wanted to do was lay hands on people. So some of those stories are really fun, like fun as in interesting. I mean, I think I've talked to you guys about this before, but I was on a mission trip to India and our whole purpose was to pray out demons, which was awful. But there was a young man and his wife who were probably 20, both 20, and they were praying because they could not conceive. And after praying, they like ran back to their house, like literally ran, because they were so pumped to go try out this new prayer if it worked. So that's funny. But, there are other serious things, right? Where we prayed for people, or I have had people pray for me, and those things didn't happen. And it always goes back to a measurement of your faith. And I think that that's the problem that I have with faith healing. It somehow is connected to how good you are or how faithful you are. And so for those people who have been praying earnestly for God to heal them, when they're not healed, it leaves them in a place of, what have I done wrong? Instead of acknowledging the fact that shit just happens. There's no answers to these experiences, whether healed or unhealed. When I was in college, there was a megachurch that bought our property, and they were a health and wealth sort of church. And their lead pastor actually got cancer and stepped down because he said that he couldn't lead them because there was something obviously in his life that led him to get cancer. He had preached for so long this message that when it finally knocked at his door, then he had to follow up with what he had been saying, right? So he had to step down. It really split the church because they wanted to know, what was that sinful thing you were doing, pastor? And he couldn't really answer. Instead of just saying, shit happens. So,
but in that context, Casey, that pastor, to me, that's got some integrity. If this pastor's been preaching that message and is expecting people to believe it and truly believes it himself, and then it's horrible. I think it's terrible to equate getting cancer with being flawed somehow. But there was integrity in his willingness to go, I really believe this. I've taught it to all of you. And so therefore, this is a sign that I've done something and I'm not worthy of leadership. So I have a lot of respect and compassion for that, even though I think it's kind of whacked.
It's unfortunate because even the teachings of Jesus, right? People were looking for an explanation for the suffering for someone. Like, what did this person do wrong? And Jesus is like, no, you're asking the wrong question. Yeah, you're asking the wrong question completely. It's not this sin in this person's life.
That's
right.
Or the family's sin, right? Yeah.
Or even the whole not enough faith thing. So I come from a biblicist background. That's why everything like triggers in my brain about, reading and interpreting scriptures and where's a scripture for something. But even in the scenarios and text where someone is not healed because of a lack of faith, it was always the lack of faith of like the followers of Jesus trying to perform a miracle. It was never the person receiving something who didn't have enough faith to have that miracle happen. And so it was like, I read those things completely differently now. But when I think about, like Benny Hinn or whatever, he was a faith healer, right? So you think about all of these powerful people who are, their whole rhetoric is invested in their own power and their own faith. Like, they have to have enough faith and power to heal other people. So there's this, it's unfortunate to me, and I don't want to demonize whole groups. Maybe people have experiences and they're listening and they have good experiences of Pentecostal churches, and it's something that, feeds into their faith and it's a little life-giving way. And I'd love to hear more about that. But you necessarily set up this dynamic where you're pressurizing sick people to be healed, to prove that a leader is connected to God somehow. And so there's this weird cycle of like pressurizing sick people who are already vulnerable and are already looking for a community to come around them to have to prove that they've been healed or something for people to actually really be with them and celebrate them. So you don't have a community that's like, let's just sit with this person in their sickness, like really be present. You have this, you're commodifying sick people. And that to me is, kind of at least from what I've experienced, a toxic kind of, community.
Well, you have on the one hand, whether or not you have enough faith determines if you're healed or not. And then on the other hand, I know I worked with somebody in the hospital when I was a chaplain resident for a year, and I spent a lot of time in the oncology unit. And I worked with a young woman who was like 30, I think, had 3 kids under age 5 and a very aggressive cancer. She was going to die. And she believed that her cancer was given to her so that God could receive glory in her healing. So there's another side of it. There's this belief that I can be a vessel for this miracle that then will give God glory, which has a really damaging effect on people who are going to die.
And the people around them, right? I mean, those 3 little kids who are hearing mom say, God is going to heal me. This is for God's glory. And then when mom dies, where does that leave these young people? Like,
Exactly.
and I think that that's my biggest frustration with this language and how we use it, because it's manipulative, and it's also most of the time, let's be honest, most of the time, a real disappointment. Like, for the people who are using these tools or this language and are saying things like, God can heal you, and you just have to have enough faith, and la-di-da. Well, those things happen less than the actual outcome, which is death or illness, right? I think it's damaging, quite frankly.
So even if it's true, even if God does heal people, even if there is some sort of thing that happens every once in a while, the way that people go about it is damaging in and of itself.
Right. So I think going back to what both you were saying, and Bunny, I'm glad you brought that up about like God's glory and everything. And Alan, what you were talking about earlier with the scriptural example of the blind man and stuff like that, there's no sin. But Jesus did explicitly said that he was given this sickness for this very moment. And I think that the problem and I don't normally,
because he was a Messiah. That's not like,
but still, it doesn't change the fact that he said explicitly this person was given a sickness so that I could have a moment right now, you know? And I think, and I don't normally say this, but I think that in this particular issue, the Bible is the problem, is because we are using proof texts about something medical. And I'm not saying, and kind of going back to like, where's that line and stuff like that. I would never discount someone who genuinely believes there's no explanation. I have been healed. It was some sort of divine intervention. I think that is a wonderful thing to believe. My problem is then when you take your experience and then you try to create a formula, especially if you're in a place of leadership, to say, this is how it was done for me. Therefore, I'm going to build a theology and a formula, and you have to follow it. And it has to be done for you because that's how God works, or that's how the divine works. And I think that's the problem, is that these theologies I'm putting that in quote, have been developed to put people in a bad place. Like being in an environment where faith healing was a thing, and being in an environment where seeing the frustration for people when they pray over and over again and they're not healed. It's not just like sad for that moment. It's a sad environment in general, because what it does is it's created this whole false dichotomy, kind of going back to a little bit what you brought up earlier, Alan, of what is healing? What is health? What is it? So it not only it doesn't become then just about that person and whether their current affliction is going to be healed or whatever. It becomes about that person, and that person will never be whole. And if they're not, then there's something wrong with them already when there's something ailing them. So you're adding this self-imposed spiritual sickness on top of this person's affliction that may or may not be something that it's never going to not be a part of their lives, but we're continuing to other them by surrounding them and putting in an environment of language that sets them apart in a way that is demeaning and demoralizing.
I really think that healing is actually about dignity.
That's
dignity
exactly
and
right.
wholeness. So for me, what I often tell people is like, I don't like when people read those texts, like the idea that they were healed wasn't the big deal. The thing that was the big deal was that they were able to return to their families. They were able to return to the temple. They were restored to community and to themselves. So for me, the idea is like, when we are praying for these people, really what we should be doing is surrounding them and making sure that they're not lost, that they're not separated from community, right? That the healing comes actually in them feeling more supported than they've ever felt, more loved than they've ever felt, more connected to their church, to the people that love them. Like that to me is a more powerful healing than the healing itself, because you guys are right. Some of the things that people are being prayed for are things that are not actually going to ever go away. And so what we're doing is, or what people are doing when they are saying, you can be healed from this, is inflicting, as you said, Jeff, a spiritual sickness to say you're not good enough as you are. And I think that is the message. If there is a message of the gospel, you are good as you are, is the one that we're robbing people of, and is actually the one that we all most need.
You nailed it, Casey. While I was hearing Jeff talk, I wrote down restoration to community, literally. And like, you're exactly right. The ironic thing in all that is we've missed the people. They become their illness or their otherness. And all we see in those communities is someone to be healed and not an actual person that is in the midst of that. I have a friend who in college had something called trigeminal neuralgia. And that is, there's a facial nerve in your forehead going down into your like jaw that if you have this syndrome, it basically has the most incredible pain in your face and in your head, and it's completely debilitating. And he watched it ruin his relationships with his family, with his friends. Nobody who's had chronic illness, everyone who's had a chronic illness can say how much it's affected their relationship with the community and their ability to be really connected. And you're right, Casey, healing is connecting with the people who are disconnected because of their difficulties, who don't get to have that close knit, even regular life with people. It becomes all about something else and may physically take them out of community. I think you've converted me. I think, Casey, I'm a faith healer in the sense that we should be majoring on belonging, and that's where the healing is.
Well, I think part of the problem is the way that we've structured our communities is that the only value you are to a community is how much you contribute to it. And if we continue,
Correct.
If we continue to build our churches and our community based off the tithers, the leaders, all the people that are just giving, and then secretly, none of us would ever say this, but secretly we develop communities where people who are a drain on the community we let them feel that. If we're honest, we let them feel it. We don't say it, but we let them feel it in the way that we pray over them, or that we continue to talk about how brave they are in the midst of their struggle, instead of just letting them be and letting them be in the midst of that. And I think that that's another issue, is that if we're going to say that a community is healing, because I think you're right on, Casey and Alan, like, it is a restoration of community. I think that that's probably the best definition of sin scripturally is, when sin is dealt with, it's always in conjunction with restoration to the community itself. And I think that if we're going to do that, then we really need to reevaluate our community. So maybe that's another episode, but I think that that's a key issue, because we're only going to perpetuate the hurt if the community doesn't value someone for just being.
Can we recognize that Jeff said scripturally, just real quick before we move on?
Hey, I'm with you, Alan. I'm like 100%. Like most of the time, I love the Bible. I still read it and study it on a regular basis. I think it's wonderful.
Oh my God.
Bonnie, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was just thinking, as you were talking, the truth is that if your faith isn't relevant and helpful when you need healing, then it's not worth anything.
Yes.
And so part of what we're talking about is faith healing, is how is faith useful when healing is needed? And I think, this dichotomy between whole and brokenness, or not well and well, that's part of our problem, because it's much easier to scapegoat folks among us and focus all of our healing energy towards people that we somehow deem is in need of healing, without looking at our own need for healing.
Coming back to that point about contributing, and we make people feel about that. Jeff, your episode with Elizabeth Jeffries, there's a segment where she talks about contributing and participating, and we're so focused on contribution. What about just participating? And in this case, somebody who's not well, whatever the ailment is, can participate fully by being there. They can contribute. Their contribution may be different than the American definition of contribution. So I think being very thoughtful about those things in our whatever communities we're dealing with, whether it be family, friends, church, temple, to hold both of those with value.
But I think it's really important that we don't think of those people who participate and don't contribute as not well. That's not a helpful, connection to make. Sometimes we just participate because we need to participate, not because we're not
You could be not well. You might be tired. You might be, wiped out. I don't know.
I wonder about what it would mean for us to look at this in just being. So for me, like, I recognize that the biggest sin of the church is the way that capitalism has infected us. Like, all of this idea of faith healing comes from the same idea that we use economically, which is, you pull yourself up by your bootstraps. What you have is what you deserve. And so if you're faithful, then you have more, including health and wealth. And so I wonder about, how we even come to this place of saying it's not even about when you show up what you pray for, but is it just a celebration of being? I was with some of the people in my congregation who no longer can attend worship on Sunday morning because their health will not allow it. I was thinking, like, what do they need? Like, when I show up here, what are they looking for? So I always bring my Bible and my communion kit. And this last time I just decided not to do that. And instead I just showed up and said, what do you want to talk about today? And the whole mood changed in being with them, because what I came assuming they wanted, which was prayer for healing, prayer for their aches and pains, turned into a conversation about family and staying connected to people. And the joy of having their pastor come and just ask them questions about their something like 20 great-grandchildren. That when I left, I felt like that was more spiritual than anything I had ever provided them before, because it was about connection and not about these spiritual things that I thought they needed or I thought they wanted. I mean, a lot of times in Scripture, if we're going to go to Scripture, Jesus will ask, like, what do you need? As a way to give people dignity to say the things that they are looking for, the things they want. And there's never an assumption about, well, this is what you should want or this is what you should do. And I think even the conversation around who is sick and who is well, like you were saying, Bonnie, begins to start with that's the problem in the first place.
And another problem is thinking that somehow death is the opposite of healing.
Right.
It's the ultimate healing, Bonnie. It's the ultimate healing.
Well, I think that understanding that death is the ultimate healing is a much gentler way to approach the conversation. I mean, I've used it in the hospital many times.
Well, it's been
same
true.
Idea.
Yeah, you're right. For some people, that's...
because I think this idea that you're not believing enough, that's why you're not being healed, is far more damaging and spiritually abusive. I also think this idea that you have this opportunity to give God glory through your cancer or whatever it is very damaging and spiritually abusive. But to bust up our notion that somehow death is the opposite of healing, I think, that's probably a Western notion as well. We want this everlasting life here on this earth, and that none of us are going to have that. So
I think that is an important perspective. I think the work that you and Alan have done in hospitals is an important perspective for this conversation. And clearly, when I say death, the ultimate healing, I think that was used as a way to perpetuate the things that you just mentioned that are wrong in terms of healing and stuff like that. So I think that's I just want to say that out loud so that people don't think I'm an ass, because I agree. I think that's an important perspective, and I think that context is so important with all of this.
Bonnie had like a flyby moment that I think I want to kind of return to me is the question in this, having worked in hospitals, is how is faith useful when you need healing? That is a great question, because that's the actual crux of it. I have seen personally, and maybe this is the way it should be, I don't really know. I've seen people's faith be a healing thing for them when they're in the hospital and they're facing something awful. I've seen the opposite, where people's faith is a tormenting thing when they're in the hospital. And I don't know if I have the right to tell them that it shouldn't be a tormenting thing. Like, it is awful. It is awful to think of a creator of the universe that I have some sort of relationship with, that I'm sitting here and suffering. Like those two things are just interesting in and of themselves. And I don't know if I'm there to relieve someone of that existential angst in the midst of their suffering, but I've seen faith work those two different ways. And I'm kind of interested, like, it is fascinating to see faith really be a healing thing for someone when they're going through suffering. And it's surprising. It never kind of works the way that I think it's going to. Like all the chaplains I know who've been doing it for 30 years and they've seen people die, they've seen people suffer. Their theology is constantly in flux because they may think that, God never heals someone. That's like their solid thing. And then they have these experiences that they just can't explain. Or on the opposite, they think that God heals everybody. And then it's like, well, spend 10 minutes. Spend 10 minutes in the hospital and you'll walk out thinking very differently.
I think it would be helpful to just let miracles be miracles. Just let them be miracles. Just let them be this expression of mystery that is the beyond that we'll never understand or be able to, we can reach toward but never touch. What if faith enabled us to do that? To just let miracles be miracles.
Right. Just to be. I mean, that's, I have people in my congregation that'll say, this thing happened, I prayed for it. Was that God and Jesus? Did they do that for me? And I'll say, well, what do you think? And they'll say, well, yeah, I think that. And then I'll say, then sure. And I don't say that passively, but it's sort of like, who am I to make that decision for you? Like, I'm so cautious with things like that because you're right, Bonnie. Like, I don't want to take away anybody's experience or say that can't happen because I know better than that, right? And so just honoring people where they are. I think the only thing I would say is in moments, at least in pastoral ministry, if I have people coming into my office that are feeling tormented by their faith and waiting for God to do this thing and it's not happening, maybe that's the opportunity to have a conversation about, things don't always work out the way that we hope they do. And that's not God punishing us or God abandoning us. God is with us in this pain, right?
And that's what faith is for, right? It's this accompaniment during the suffering. And I think it's hard for us to wrap our minds around that because it feels like if God is with me, then why wouldn't God fix whatever it is that I'm struggling with? And of course, that's why I love process theology so much, right?
I was hoping you'd just dive on in.
Because the answer to that in a process perspective is God can't. God can only be with. To me, anyways, that's a great comfort and a way that I can sink into faith in times of really deep suffering and in times of grief.
I find it really important to still center not wanting beings to suffer. I'm not there to relieve all suffering or to explain all suffering. Like, you think of the Buddhist practice, and I'm not Buddhist, so this is just something I envy about that religion, is like, may all beings be free from suffering is kind of a central tenet. Like holding on to that, not letting that go. I think I experience God when nurses go into someone who's having an epileptic fit or they're having something really awful happening to them and giving them that medicine. That's a divine moment, like there really is something there that is, to me, divine. And I know that's like a double-edged sword and is complex, and before we get any further, on in the conversation or away from it, or can I just say an aside that we may not have faith healing in most mainline churches. At least from my perspective, I don't see that everywhere. But there are like energy healings and Reiki is like a really big thing in all of these churches I've been to. And I think it's a fascinating juxtaposition. It's like, no, all you faith healers, but we'll have our own kind of, not we, but mainline churches will have their own kind of energy healing stuff. I mean, I had people like give me energy healings like at conferences or in my church. I feel something. I'll just say that. It was wonderful. Oh my God. It was so great.
You're wonderful. I also like this, Pastor, will you pray for, I don't know, let's make up a name. Like, will you pray for Janie this week? She is feeling really alone and isolated. She could really use that. And I'm like, well, yeah, but if you're praying for her, why don't you call her up? Why don't you go see her? Will you pray for so-and-so? They really could use... Look, God has no hands but yours, no feet but yours. Like, it's the same concept with thoughts and prayers, y'all. Like when you're sending those prayers into the universe, hoping that God will do something, it might require that you get off your ass and do it.
It has to require that.
Right.
Rajiv, how about you? Because I feel like when we started this conversation that the next conclusion that you might have had, the way that you expressed yourself in terms of your Seventh-day Adventist background was that they were demonized, but that there's another side of that coin where your thoughts on the possibility or movement forward of some sort of spiritual healing. And I was just curious as to your background, especially in connection to, and again, this is out of ignorance, but the Hinduism, and I wonder if you had any thoughts in that direction.
So one thing that I think we're missing a bit in this conversation is faith healing is not some new thing. It's not some American thing. It's global and it's ancient. Different traditions have done it in different ways. So casting judgment or claiming understanding of things that aren't our own are difficult and inappropriate. So in that regard, I'm struggling to really have too many strong opinions about the subject because I didn't grow up with it, other than growing up with it to otherize it, to vilify it. Again, coming back to this idea, Casey brought up the idea of community and restoration to community. When I think about the cultural context and Indian communities and others too, but people gather to mourn. People show up to be together when someone is sick, when there's been an accident, and certainly towards end of life situations where you know it's coming. People show up and they hold vigil, and there's a lot of beauty in those rooms. And then funerals too are particularly well attended because it's not the end, in multiple ways of understanding, whether you're a Christian and you think that there's some sort of afterlife, or you're Hindu and are sure that there's some kind of rebirth to be had. But it is a passage. It marks a passage. So I think in our, the initial premise of the conversation, faith healing in America, in charismatic movements, laying on of hands, Benny Hinn and others, I feel bad for people in some cases because I think they've been used by really capable, manipulative leaders to extract money, loyalty, and devotion from them. I don't vilify or don't have hard feelings for the people who are true believers in that because, that's what you got. You got your beliefs. And then I have a lot of admiration for folks who fully live into those beliefs, like the pastor that we talked about earlier. And a lot of admiration for folks who go, like Jeff, in your case, I can picture it. I have a little movie in my head of you standing there and the pastor trying to knock you over and you're not moving. It's like what you're supposed to do. So you have inserted yourself in that scene as someone who's like, yeah, I'm not quite buying this because it's not holding true. But I would never claim someone wasn't healed when they believe they were healed through faithful means. I think healing is something to be celebrated, however you think it got there.
I just finished a book, Holy Envy by Barbara Brown Taylor, and it just recently came out, and it's her experience of interactions with other traditions that are not her own as a professor of religions, world religions at a college. And it's kind of a biographical thing, less of an information dump and more of her own experience interacting with other religions. Totally worth reading if you are going through what it's like to critically look at your own tradition, to interact with ones that are different. Don't compare, with some of the stuff she talks about, are some of the kind of tenets of pluralistic society. Don't compare your best to another tradition's worst, that kind of thing. Leave room for holy envy where you're able to see something good in another tradition. And, don't just take stuff that's from someone else and then use it in a way that is culturally appropriative, that kind of stuff. And listening to Rajiv talk, it's just stewing in my mind. I'm in the same place. I don't want to totally invalidate or judge another tradition's experience of this because this subject is pretty wide outside of America. Great book for anyone looking into it.
And any other final thoughts or feelings about this particular issue?
Yeah, I would say get healed. Be with people, be honest about your maladies, and in sharing community, there is healing.
I second that.
And let people be healed on their terms. Don't force them to somehow be your normal. Actually see the person instead of just the difference or something like that.
And maybe I'd add, like, some of the things that you think that you are plagued with, or the things that you see as illness or sickness, maybe are not. And I think that goes back to what Bonnie was saying earlier. Like, when we talk about what it means to be whole or not whole or whatever, like even in teaching the Enneagram, I'm no longer using words like healthy and unhealthy, because those come with lots of baggage.
Yeah, and healthy and unhealthy depends on the context. Yeah. I would say my words to add are rooted deeply within my own tradition, the tradition of my upbringing. And that is that Jesus is very complicated on this issue. And I think it's okay to just allow Jesus and all those healing stories to be contradictory, to be difficult to try to figure out how to draw theology from, and to be as complex as this conversation has been.
Hell yeah.
For sure. I feel like my journey with this podcast is just throwing out language that is useless. So I'm just going to ride that train and resonate with Casey and really reevaluate the words that we're using. Like, why even use the word healing and whole and broken? And at the very least, really, really qualifying language like that, because it is so, it's so polarizing. And I think that our spiritual language overall needs an overhaul. I don't know what we do, axioms or some kind of qualification to make it less polarizing. Like heaven, hell, good, bad, divine, human. Like, we have all of these juxtapositions of two extremes in all of our language. And I really think it's time to start bridging the gap for those, for the sake of inclusion. For the sake of creating a community where people are going to feel like they are okay. Period. Not that they're going to be okay. Not that they're going to live into their purpose. Not that they're going to have this breakthrough, but that they are. They are. And being good with that and having language that reflects that idea. So yeah.
And that they have community that will do all they can to ease the suffering.
And recognize their suffering, not invalidate it in any way.
Right. Well, let us know what you think. You can add your voice to this particular conversation. You can comment at the show notes at irenicast.com/152. I can't believe we're in the 150s. I'm still blown away by that. Also in the show notes, you'll find relevant links and a complete list of all the other ways to like, follow, and contact the show. That's irenicast.com/152. On the other side of the music, we're going to be playing a round of good news, bad news. The last time we played this segment, it was with Mona, and I'll just say it got weird. It was talking about playing with Trump's hair, and it just got weird. So I look forward to how weird it's going to get on the other side of the music. All right, so good news, bad news. So I don't know how many people, the last time we did this game, it was with Mona, and this is how it's going to work, is that someone's going to start with good news. Like, for instance, good news, I was invited to Alton Brown's house for dinner. That would be my good news, right? And then someone would follow up with,
the bad news is no one knows who Alton Brown is.
Oh, no. We shouldn't be starting the segment by fighting.
The good news is that you have been allowed in this podcast, regardless of the fact that you know who the hell Alton Brown is. I'm stopping this right now.
Okay. Yeah, and you make it up on the spot, right?
Exactly.
Man, the last time we did this, it was a different world. It was like 3 or 4 years ago.
I'm going to Google him right now.
Are you serious? You don't know who it is?
Alton Brown is the patron saint of
Good Eats. You never saw Good Eats?
Nope.
Anyway. That's okay.
I hope
It
that
takes
this
all
is
kinds of
a
people.
moment that you will look back on in the podcast and be like, my world has been changed because I have been exposed to one of the great culinary minds of our world who have influenced such great minds like Kenji Lopez Alt and the bearer of one of the greatest cookbooks of all time, The Food Lab.
I think I've seen him selling nonstick cookware.
Yes.
Okay,
Rajiv.
so anyway, the segment.
He's not sold nonstick
He
cookware.
is spicy today.
He is given information on the best cookware to
man.
purchase. All right, let's go. I've clearly been offended. I've been wronged. And we will move on. And I will expect within the next few weeks your apology after you've seen and binged several episodes of Good Eats and have been I don't like using the word exposed, but
Yeah, but I don't need Alton Brown, Jeff. I have you.
it's true.
That's right.
I will be your
Aw.
Alton Brown, Rajiv. Aw. If we could hug right now, I would. Over
Amen.
Zoom.
That's
a Zoom
pretty rare.
hug.
I'll take it.
All right. So how the game's going to work. Someone says good news. Someone says bad news. We go back and forth. Hilarity ensues, as you've seen thus far. And we'll go. So let's go in the order of our intro, right? So I'll start just the first round, and then we'll go Alan, Bonnie, Casey, Rajiv. That sound like a good way to go.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Brown people are used to being last.
Whoa.
Dang.
Gotta
This
think
just got like...
Gotta think deeply about that one.
You can cut
Can
that
you
out.
just please not?
It's the segment. It just came out.
It's not the segment for you. Just take a break.
I feel like I'm in a cloud of white guilt right now.
I have
need to
zero
push-
guilt.
I
So
push my way through it.
The look that Bonnie just shot you, Rajiv, was like,
Yeah, I see it all the time.
See, this is the stuff that may get cut out, but you save for future release, someday.
I don't think this is getting cut out. This is good stuff.
Probably not.
All right, so let's go. Despite we're just gonna stick with the order.
Despite the racial order of things.
Exactly, and it despite that you volunteered yourself last in the intro, but we won't go back to that. We won't bring
It
up.
goes by. We'll just say it
old
goes by
news.
level of immaturity and gets progressively better. Is that better?
Whoa,
Yeah, that's
what?
good.
That's not better. I'm at the top. What the hell?
He gets upset over things like Alton Brown. That's okay.
I can care less about getting upset about healing and things that matter.
so what is
but-
the good news, Jeff? What
All
is
right.
the good news?
The good news is let's make this meta. The good news is that Irenicast has had an influx of listeners, and we are now getting 2 million downloads an episode.
The bad news is the lost city of Atlantis just got a connection to the internet, and so they're trying to learn about the surface world. And that's why we're getting all the downloads.
the good news is Atlantis is no longer a lost city. It's a found city.
The bad news is there are all these diseases that they have that we didn't, and now we have them.
Fish diseases.
We're all scaly and stuff. The good news is Jesus saves, and we find an antidote for all those fish illnesses.
The bad news is they refuse to believe in Jesus and are not being healed.
The good news is they have a much better savior that's half fish, half human.
Aquaman?
And I just watched that movie, okay? That's why we're doing this, probably.
The good news is their savior's a woman. She's a mermaid.
The bad news is she's not as cool as Bonnie.
The good news is we're drawing to a close.
Yay! We did our first shot. That's
not
so
not to pun this, but we certainly jumped the shark on that one.
Whoa.
That's
So
good.
great.
You have to put that in there.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, so that was not bad for a first round, regardless of how we went from the show and wonderful listeners to
Atlantis.
and Aquaman, and of course I'm not mad at the comic book implications of that. So Alan, do you want to just start us off this time?
Okay, this one's going to get, deeply personal. So
it always
are you guys
does.
Ready? Rajiv was asking for accountability, so here we go. The good news is Rajiv wrote a book.
The bad news is it's about all of us.
The good news is it's a top seller.
The bad news is I'm on a hit list.
The good news is that I'm reflected glowingly in the words of Rajiv in his book, and I have become a wonderful celebrity and have done wonderful things to help the masses.
The bad news is people have started showing up at your house and camping on your front lawn.
That is bad news. I don't like that. Even just the hypothetical gives me a visceral
The good
reaction.
news is we have a BB gun.
It was my turn.
It was. You skipped
Sorry,
turns.
go ahead. I know it was.
Yeah,
I just
what's the good news?
It's my freaking book.
This is not all good news, Rajiv.
The good news is you're still going to be alive at the end of the day. After all of this.
The bad news
Cut
is
that out,
you
cut
might
that
be
out.
single.
Are we talking about Rajiv or Jeff?
Yeah.
Rajiv.
Oh, good news is so hard to find sometimes.
Oh.
I think we've lost the logic thread on this one.
Yeah.
It's gone.
Yeah.
It's gone.
That was a good shot.
All right, Bonnie, we're counting on you. Start us off. Let's
Here's some good
get out of
news.
Atlantis and publishings and audience and,
Yeah,
and let's get into
totally.
something real, something substantial.
Okay. Are you ready? It's 2020. And the good news is a woman has been elected president.
Yes.
What's the
Can
bad
we
news,
end
Casey?
right there?
What's the bad news, Casey?
The bad news is it's Hillary Clinton.
Oh, dang. Way to bolster any white supremacists we may have in the audience.
Yeah, the bad news is that's helpful, Rajiv. The bad news is it's Sarah Palin.
Oh, there you go.
So give us the good news, Rajiv.
The good news is the vice president is Michelle Obama.
The bad news is that reality has exploded everyone's mind and no one understands the world anymore.
Okay. The good news is they plan to give something free to everyone.
The bad news is it's going to be free coal.
The good news is that California could not stand for that and has seceded from the union.
The bad news is Joe Rogan is California's president.
Hey, that's complex news. It's not just bad, it's complex news. Okay.
The good news is that since Joe Rogan has the most popular podcast in the United States, the medium of podcast is more celebrated than ever, and Irenicast is finding more listeners all the time. See,
We're getting away
bringing
from that.
it back. No, we're bringing it back to
Why does it have to be so self-serving?
self-serving's fine.
I can't.
All right.
The bad news is that Sarah Palin's our biggest fan.
The good news is she can see us from Alaska.
Yay!
That's the one to end on.
I
right
can
there.
see Irenicast from my house.
All right.
Are we going on to the next one?
Let's do one more. Casey, let's
The good
let's
news
end on
is we're
yours.
going to a drag show.
The bad news is Mike Pence is a special guest.
The good news is that I discovered I look fabulous in eye makeup.
The bad news is, so did Mike Pence. He discovered that you look good in it.
Hey, if I can help in any way.
The good news is we discover that Mike Pence has a whole different side to him.
The bad news is we can't leave until Mike Pence performs. You make me feel like a natural woman.
Oh my god. That was bad news, right? That was bad news. The good news is the ghost of Aretha Franklin reappears and disappears Mike Pence.
The bad news is that Death has done a number on her vocal cords and we don't get to hear a live rendition.
The good news is she decides to lip sync while Casey sings.
Oh my god. Can we call it?
Yeah, can we call it? Because I can't think of bad
This
news.
is so bad.
Oh my god.
Well, the bad news is that there's 4 people listening still.
But the good news is
the good news is that those 4 people
but Rajiv has to give
really
us his
love
good
us.
news.
Does that include or exclude the Atlantis listeners?
That's right. I'm telling you.
Oh my goodness.
That's when they dropped off.
yeah.
They decided to be lost again.
We don't sound
After
good
this
underwater.
episode.
The surface can have its problems, you know. We can
Oh
keep
my
them.
goodness. All right. Well, if for some reason you have found value in the show and would like to support us,
I have.
go to irenicast.com/support. There you'll find new ways to support the show, including a PayPal link to donate, Amazon, and of course our new merch at irenicast.com/support. You'll find links for all of that stuff. And don't forget to subscribe to the show and never miss an episode. We're available on all major podcasting platforms: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Pandora, and many more. And while you're there, if your platform allows it, leave us a rating and or review. We're always looking for more and more ways to hear from you. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Alan.
I'm Bonnie.
I'm Casey.
This is Rajiv.
Thanks for joining the conversation.